Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 7 game from the Marshall GM Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 6 video, you know that I had a very interesting draw in a rook endgame in round 6 against Kamrakulov, and I actually was winning the rook endgame and didn't put him away. It did require some technique, but well, it was when I kind of got away from me, and now I was playing another tough Grandmaster with black. My opponent in this one was Grandmaster Oliver Barbosa of the Philippines. He's been living in New York for some time now as a chess coach, but is not as active as he once was, but is still a very, very dangerous opponent, and was sure to be a very tough challenge with the black pieces. So, anyways, let's get into it. So, Barbosa played c4, I went e6, knight c3, d5, d4, knight f6, and c takes d5, e takes d5. And we've transposed through a little bit of an interesting move word to a Queen's Gambit exchange variation, which is actually quite popular these days, and is a very interesting way of meeting the Queen's Gambit. Now, the idea with this, in many respects, comes on the next move with bishop g5, and the point is you pin this knight on f6, and you have no bad pieces because you get the bishop outside of the pawn chain, and what transpires is white goes e3, queen c2, bishop d3, knight e2 or f3, and then essentially tries to get this minority attack going on the queen side. That's what white tries to do. Black, on the other hand, typically puts the bishop on e7 or d6, considers putting the knight on d7, castles, and, tries to play on the king side and through the center with the e4 square. Now, I know that was a lot of ideas, but we're going to see a lot of that kind of borne out in this game, so just keep in mind some of those things I mentioned. So anyways, bishop g5, c6. The point is here to reinforce the pawn. Note that if let's say I made a lazy move like h6, after bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, I would be dropping a pawn. And of course, taking with the g pawn is kind of ugly, so we don't want that. So that's why you play c6. And then e3 is played. There is a line here, actually, that does spoil the pawn structure with bishop f5. The idea is that this bishop gets to the diagonal before the bishop or the queen does. But here, white normally goes queen f3, and the point is this endgame is thought to be fairly unpleasant for black because of these double pawns, and because of that, black doesn't have a good pawn break, because if you go c5, you're giving yourself an isolani on d5, and see here, these pawns are so ugly you can't actually get off a pawn break. So black is relatively passive in this type of position, and that's why bishop f5 isn't played as much. I wouldn't want to go for that static pawn structure, so I went for bishop e7. It's more solid. And then white went bishop d3. I went knight bd7. Again, this is the other idea, is you consider maneuvering the knight via f8 to e6, or sometimes you even just put the knight on b6. And so the point with not castling right away is you get to see kind of what white is trying to do. White played rook b1, and this rook b1 was a little bit of an unusual move to me and a surprise, not because the minority attack isn't in the cards, but it normally isn't in the cards this early. So the fact that he was playing rook b1 this early is suggesting he thinks he can play b4 already this fast. Now, I was kind of surprised about that. I didn't really buy it. So I actually just kind of castled, and I was like, bring it on. If you play b4, this probably isn't a good move. I mean, queen c2 was played, but let's say b4 is played. I thought I could attack this chain right away by playing a5, and it didn't seem like black was in any problems because white isn't well suited to advance so quickly. After a move like b5, I thought I'd have some options connected to bishop b4 or even c5 in these structures. And sometimes if white is too quick with the minority attack on the b file, he weakens some critical squares on the c file that are left behind by the b pawn. So I thought, okay, maybe I might have an isolani, but maybe I have counterplay on the c file if you go for this type of system. So because of that, I think, white also kind of acknowledged, yeah, I was just teasing you with b4. I wasn't going to play it right away. And went queen c2, which is a more standard move, keeping an eye on this h6 pawn so that if my knight ever leaves, black has this idea, or white has this idea of bishop takes f6 and bishop takes h7 check. So because of that, I went h6 just to, make sure that pawn wouldn't be hanging and free my knight. And after bishop h4, I went knight h5. And this maneuver is fairly common when you play h6. The idea is that once the bishop is retreated to h4, it actually doesn't have a square where they aren't forced off the board, those bishops. And black's argument is that by trading one pair of minor pieces, in particular these bishops, he alleviates the congestion on the king side in his position, and he kind of helps his development because the queen comes to e7 and the rooks are closer to being connected. So that's kind of the argument. Bishop takes e7 was played, queen takes e7, and after queen takes e7, you actually see the other hidden agenda here for black, which is actually sometimes to get in knight f4. The point is that the pawn is pinned and the queen is on e7, so knight f4 is actually a legitimate move. So white aims to deal with that by going knight g2, and now the point is knight f4 can just be snapped off by the knight or the pawn on e3. But yeah, sometimes you might get a knight f3 sighting, and then this knight f4 move comes into play, and it's kind of annoying because it hits the bishop, and it also hits the g2 pawn, and you really don't want to give up this bishop on d3. So anyways, knight g2, my opponent is a GM, so sees the one-move threats. And I went g6. G6 is a little bit controversial. I had a clear-cut idea with this move. The idea was that I wanted to blunt the bishop on d3. I wanted to actually trade it off eventually by going for this maneuver with knight g7 and bishop f5. The flaw in this plan is that, white's kind of fast with the minority attack, and the question is, am I really comfortable, just allowing him to play b4, b5 and get that break in, which undermines my pawn chain? Because what we will see is that, when this break comes, it can be kind of unpleasant. Anyways, after g6, white castled. Makes sense. And I went knight g7, kind of playing a little bit on autopilot to get my plan going. Again, my idea is to go knight f6 or knight b6, and then bishop f5. And with my knight supporting that bishop on f5, I'm able to trade arguably white's most important piece, which is that bishop on d3 in these structures. The issue is that I'm just allowing this minority pawn push. So we're going to see whether that matters or not. So b4, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He goes for it. And I went a6. The reason I went a6, and I think this is an important move, is, b5 is going to come eventually. Like, I can't stop it. So I can only delay it. And the point is by playing a6, I actually force him to play a4 to get the minority attack in. And that means that we actually trade one additional pair of pawns, and that after these a pawns are traded, my rook has an open file to play with. So the idea is that, okay, you're getting in b5, but at least I'm going to have activity for this my pawn structure maybe being a little bit softened up. The reason that the minority attack, by the way, is so frustrating for black to deal with is that it's a question about the base of the pawn chain. So you look at the base of black's pawn chain on the queen side, it's this b7 pawn. So the extent to which white can get at undermining that base is critical. Now, on the flip side, the base of white's pawn chain on the king side, where he has the majority, is f2. And that pawn is a little bit more difficult to get at. You essentially need to execute, to challenge that base, you'd have to execute some f5, g5, f4 maneuver. And pushing the pawns in front of your king has real risks associated with it. So that's the reason why, in theory, the idea is that it's a little bit easier to play white's position, because white can actually, when white's executing the minority attack, they actually can get at the base of black's pawn structure, or black's pawn majority on the queen side, a little bit easier than black can get at white's base on the king side. That's where the kind of the imbalance exists. Now, in recent years, AlphaZero, the supercomputer that was created by DeepMind, a subsidiary of Google. AlphaZero actually demonstrated that the minority attack is not as dangerous as it actually appears at first sight, but you wouldn't know it by looking at this game, because you actually can sort of see that white very quickly gets off an initiative, and I haven't really begun to get something going on the king side with my own pieces. So typically, black needs to try and play h5, h4 to try and soften up white's king side. But if I'm not laying any blows to this pawn structure, and this pawn structure just remains really basically intact, I'm going to have some problems. So anyway, I went a6, a4 was played, again, just trying to get at b5. And now I went knight f6, preparing my bishop f5 move, right? Preparing to trade these bishops. And now b5 came, and I took on b5, a takes b5, and then a takes e5. And this is the first really critical position of the game, because, you know, it appears like white is getting everything they want. Like b takes c6 is in the cards, and then I have this weak pawn on c6 potentially. I do have the a file for my rook as a source of counterplay. And, you know, because white pushes the pawns, there are some loose dark squares on the queen side that I can keep an eye on. So just to think about that. But the question here is whether do I allow b takes c6 or not. And the reason I say do I allow it or not is because I have an option. I could consider playing c5. Now, I didn't play this move, but it was an option. And the point is that by keeping the b file closed, this rook is not as active there. And after a subsequent exchange, I do have a weak isolated pawn, but maybe this position is not as difficult to defend as the position where this rook is really active. Now, the thing that I kind of was worried about here, and is probably the reason I rejected this line, is that after queen takes c5, there's knight e4, discovering my queen and actually threatening the knight on f6. So the point is I can't go queen takes c2 because of the very powerful and decisive intermediate move, knight takes f6 check. And the point is that white just wins a piece and then takes my queen the next move, and I'm down a piece. I could deal with this by playing queen b6, but for some reason I thought this position was a little bit too dangerous for me. I thought that now this knight can come into d4 and assume a really nice outpost here, and this b pawn seems to be stronger than my b pawn, and the c file is still open. But it could be argued that this position is a lesser evil of the position I got in the game. I'm not too sure which one is, worse, but well, they're both a little bit worse for black. But the question is like, which one seems more defensible? You think about it as the game goes on. Instead of playing c5, I decided to play bishop f5 and get on with my original plan, which was to get rid of these bishops. And I thought, I'm just going to be saddled with this weak c6 pawn, but I might have some compensation with play on the king side. B takes c6 was played. I recaptured. And then knight f4 is played. And knight f4 is a move I must say I missed, and I think it's a very, very important move. The point is that if I take on d3, the knight comes to d3, and now the c5 square can be occupied by a knight. And the knight on c5 is a very, very nice outpost because it also supports a rook invading on the b7 square. So I was very, very uncomfortable when I saw this knight f4 to d3 to c5 maneuver, and I thought, ooh, this does not look fun. The other thing, again, we talk about pawn structure a lot on this channel, and you could see as a result of this minority attack on the queen side that happened, white has one nice strong pawn island, and I have two pawn islands. So the advantage goes to white in terms of pawn structure. I went rook fb8, kind of anticipating that knight d3, knight c5, rook b7 maneuver, and I thought I need to be able to challenge on the b and a files with my rook and get some counterplay, and that's the way to kind of neutralize white's threats. White played rook fc1, keeping the tension on the file. Note that if you've seen my one of my videos in the Chess Secrets You Wish You Knew series, you know about the importance of keeping the tension on files, right? Because white doesn't necessarily want to rush and capture on b8 because I just take back and I still have control. So there's a bit of like a tug of war for I mean, tug of war is the wrong expression. It's almost like a staring contest to see who's going to blink first. I now actually did blink first and played rook takes b1 because I thought that I couldn't allow this knight to move away and then just pressure the c6 pawn with two pieces. So I thought I'd take here, and after knight takes, well, I didn't expect knight takes. I actually expected rook takes, and I thought there'd only be one attacker on the c6 pawn. But after knight takes, I actually have to worry about there being two attackers on the c6 pawn, so it's not so easy to defend. But I played rook a6, and I thought this was a clever move. The point is that I defend the pawn horizontally, and I still maintain my control over the A file. Note that this is a much better version of defending than like rook c8, where I'm just a passive participant and I have no activity elsewhere. And then note the other point is that with rook a6, the bishop can't capture on a6 because the queen on c2 is behind it. So there was a little trickeration there. Knight d2 is played, maneuvering that knight back into the game. And again, I was still very worried about this knight coming to c5, just this dreaded outpost where it would be firmly cemented by the pawn on d4. So I was still very concerned here. I went rook b6, again trying to still remain active and eye some of the dark squares on the queen side. My idea was now that if white plays a move like knight b3, I might be able to come in with queen a3 and get a little bit of activity. Sometimes you could play around the knight even though it has an outpost, and that was kind of my thought process here, is maybe I can play around the knight by controlling some important dark squares. And that's the thing about the minority attack for black. One of the defensive resources he has is some of these sensitive dark squares on the queen side, in particular because we traded the dark squared bishops early in the game, so that's a theme that tends to come up. White played queen c3, deciding that it was these dark squares were a little bit too sensitive and it was unwise to allow me to control them, and I think that's sensible. And then I went knight e6, getting my knight into the game and also trying to trade some pieces. And the idea with knight e6, which was really important, I thought, was that I'm not allowing this knight to d3. Now, we were playing the staring contest on these bishops for a while now, and I kept worried about knight d3, knight c5. Now the point is that if bishop takes f5, I don't play g takes f5, but I go knight takes f4, actually. And the point is that I'm threatening knight e2 check, and so you pretty much should recapture on f4. And then after g takes f5, I have double pawns, but so does white. And I also have this lovely outpost on e4 for my knight. Still need to get better at drawing arrows. This lovely outpost there. So, in actual fact, it seems like, blacks actually has quite a playable position here. And that was my thought, is that, these double pawns aren't the end of the world for me, because now I have some activity. So, I was quite happy to find knight e6. White played knight takes e6. I went bishop takes e6. And now h3 was played. And I managed to trade one pair of pieces, but you can see I still have this weakness on c5 and this weak pawn on c6. And I'm not out of the woods yet, so I still need to be pretty creative in defending. And I went for knight d7. I thought the idea here was to overprotect the c5 square and just pretty much discourage a knight from coming there, because I thought I'd snap it off. The other subtle idea behind knight d7 was that it also protects the rook on b6. So if you notice my position now, I only have one unprotected piece, which is this pawn on h6. And in general, if your pieces are protected, tactics aren't as big of a problem. And since I'm already worse here, I wanted to make sure that I didn't fall for any tactics. The other idea here was, in some positions, I might think about playing queen g5, which introduces the threat of bishop takes h3. And for the first time in the game, I might actually create a threat on the king side, which I failed to do earlier. So a very multi-purpose move, this knight d7. White went rook a1, I think acknowledging that the c6 pawn was well defended for now and trying to seek out a new frontier for the rook. Again, it's hard for me to do anything because I don't have any really effective pawn breaks, so I have to be very careful. I went king g7, just prophylactically defending against rook a8 check, and also covering the h6 pawn. The one thing that is I have to be a little bit careful about with the king on g7 is the queen being on this diagonal. So an e4 break could be dangerous because after e4, I can't take on e4 because there might be d5 checks. But in this position, e4 would do more harm than good because now the d4 pawn would be a little bit sensitive. So I could play queen b4, and now black would be totally fine because I would force off the queens, and now this d4 pawn would be pretty weak. So e4 doesn't work just yet. After king g7, white went rook a7, which is a good move, pinning my knight here. I went queen d6, stepping out of that pin. And now the rook has actually left the c-file, I can start thinking about c5. Now again, c5 here is not a move because of my king's position, but I do need to start thinking about it because if I'm able to get rid of my weak backward pawn, I still have the worst pawn structure because I'd have an isolated d-pawn, but it would actually be quite defensible. The backward pawn is actually more of a problem, I think, than the isolated d-pawn would be, especially if the queens come off the board. So that's kind of what I was angling for, is liberating with the c5 break. I thought that'd be like my salvation. White went knight f3, good move. Repositioning that knight, eyeing some dark squares, also potentially anticipating a c5 break. Now if I was ever to get in c5, the knight would reemerge on d4 and have a beautiful outpost, eyeing my e6 bishop, just eyeing everything and just being unassailable there, protected by the e3 pawn. So the knight on f3 is a good square for it. And now I went queen b8. Queen b8, the idea is just to hit the rook on a7, which was very active, push it back, sometimes introduce rook b3 as an idea because now the knight on d2 left the b3 square, and just continue to play actively. White went rook a3 to defend the b3 square, and I went queen d6 back. Again, now I'm kind of thinking about queen b4 in some positions. And then knight d2 was played by white. And you can see your white is kind of shuffling and doesn't have a very concrete plan just yet. But that's okay because I have to just defend kind of passively without making any mistakes, which is not easy to do. So I was trying to be very precise and patient and not fall on the sword and just make some normal moves. But it is very difficult to defend when you have no activity. So kudos to Barbosa for kind of just trying to have me fall on my sword. A lot of times when you're in a worse position, you kind of just collapse because it's hard to make moves. I went bishop f5, and you can see here that I didn't quite collapse, but I am getting a little impatient defending because I recognize that he can kind of toy with me forever. It's like, I don't know, like Tom and Jerry or something. Like I'm the mouse, and the cat is just like, trying to chase me around the whole time. It's just not a comfortable position to be in, and I wanted to change the complexion of the game. And this was my chance, I thought. The idea was that if we trade these bishops, I get rid of another pair of pieces that might ease my defensive task, and my bishop on e6 was kind of passive, so I thought it'd be good to trade it. The downside is that I give myself double pawns, but I thought that after an exchange on f5, my knight could then rush to the e4 square and have a really nice outpost there. So that was the idea. After bishop f5, white went bishop f1 and acknowledged that my idea was a reasonable one. And now I was happy because my bishop finally has a diagonal worth, writing home about. And it's definitely much better than it was on e6. I now went queen b4 because I thought, okay, my bishop's pretty active here. Now I actually can start to think about trading queens. And after queen b4, the point was that if queen takes b4, which was not played, g4 was played, but let's say queen takes b4, rook takes b4, I thought there were certain positions where I could get rook b1 and bishop d3 in. Point being is, like, let's say white makes a bad move like h4. I was looking at positions where I can go rook b2, hitting that knight, and then after knight f3, going rook b1. And I thought this pin would be very, very problematic for white. And if my bishop ever got to this diagonal, I'd be in serious business. So here, black wouldn't be worse at all, probably be a little better. So because of that, I thought now is the time to trade queens because my bishop had a good diagonal. Now, white did play g4, and g4 was a move I must say I missed. I just didn't take it very seriously, but it's actually a pretty good move because it forces my bishop off of this diagonal. But I did get to trade queens. So after queen takes c3, rook takes c3, and bishop e6, I did achieve one thing, which is I traded queens, and I thought the position with the queens off the board would be a little bit more defensible because there isn't as much pressure on the c6 pawn. So I thought, you know what, if I defend this c6 pawn and I'm able to hold up here, I didn't think I could be squeezed. That being said, white does have a space advantage on the king side with this g4 expansion and could think about putting more pressure on my position. In a dream scenario, if white got in something like h4 and g5 and was able to fix my pawns on light squares, maybe he might have an argument that I might be strategically I'm in a strategically risky position because we both have light squared bishops and my pawns might be targets. But I don't know. It's black has a tenable position. So anyways, white played knight b3, eyeing these weak squares, and I went king f6. And my idea was to run my king to d6 to reinforce the protection of the c6 pawn. And then once I protect the c6 pawn adequately, I could think about being active. So f4 was played. I think f4 is actually kind of a mistake, and we actually mentioned this after the game when we spoke together, because it does weaken the e3 pawn, and that might be a problem later. I went king e7, again shuttling that king very quickly back to d6, and after bishop d3, I can't rush with king d6 because f5 is a threat trapping my bishop. So I had to make a decision here, and the question was what to do. If I move my knight away, then c6 is not really well covered, and I forfeit the c5 square. If I move my f-pawn, well, then my pawn is hanging. If I move my f-pawn to f6, my pawn is hanging. So there was only, and if I go king f6, then I just go back where I was a moment ago. So I made the committal, but I think very correct decision to actually go f5. The reason f5 is a committal decision is because I'm putting my pawn on a light square, another one, but the thing that's interesting about it is I fixed the e3 pawn as a weakness from the standpoint that it can't be pushed anymore. And this is something that, turned out to be quite good for me, actually, because after f5, now I'm also hitting the g4 pawn. And so white decided to play g5. And after this capture, the only pawn break that white has in this position is h4, h5. But besides that, this e3 pawn can't be pushed because I have firm control over the e4 square. And this d4 pawn is kind of not doing anything. And so even though my pawns are set up on light squares, I'm actually restricting the scope of this bishop, and I'm kind of holding the fort. So I was kind of happy to see this transformation because it meant that I only had one break to worry about, which was h4, h5. Whereas a few moves ago, if we back up, I had to worry about h4, h5, I had to worry about g5, I had to worry about f5, and in one fell swoop, I kind of shut that all down. So after takes on g5, I went king d6, and you can see my journey to the queen side was successful. Now my knight is free to roam. White played king f2, and now I went rook b8 because now my rook can maneuver to a more active square because it doesn't have to tend to the c6 pawn. h4 is played, and then I went rook a8, and my idea here was to think about playing rook a2 check, but to also consider putting my rook on a3 where I pin the knight to the rook on c3. So I had two ideas, and I don't think they're easy to stop. So I felt pretty good here. White played bishop e2, defending one threat, that rook a2 move. And now I went rook a3, pinning this knight. And I thought here I had pretty good activity, even though it still appears that my structure is a little bit weak and passive. It just seemed that I was managed to get enough pressure. h5 isn't a huge problem yet, and it just seemed to have everything under control. And I also had a tactical idea with rook a3 that came up in a moment. White played h5, trying to open up a front for his king and make the g-pawn a pass pawn. I have to take because I can't allow this pawn to get to h6, so I played g takes h5. And after bishop takes h5, I think white thought he was going to be able to press for a while because he can think about playing king g3, king f4, and g6, and move the king in. But I have a very, very important move here that really neutralizes white's pressure. So why don't you pause the video and think for a minute or two and try to figure out what that move is, because it's not obvious. All right, hopefully you had a chance to pause the video and figure out what the right move was. The move I played in this position, I think the move that kind of equalizes on the spot, is c5. It's an amazing move because white can capture 3 different ways on c5, but none of them give him an advantage. Now, the issue is if white does nothing, I'm threatening c4, and I actually win a piece because of this pin. So that you can't allow that. If you play rook takes c5, the knight on b3 hangs, so that just loses a piece. And if you go knight takes e5, the rook hangs, so you can't do that. So the only way to play this one is to play d takes c5 check. But the funny thing is that after knight takes c5, this pin is still a problem, and so I'm just trading pieces, and now my king also has the e5 square as an advantage because now my king isn't in this dark squared hole that it was in. So the point is that I was able to trade my weak pawn for a good pawn on d4 and, just equalize. White played rook takes c5 because you kind of have to resolve this pin, and I took on b3. But you can see here that with such limited material, 2 versus 2, it's just hard to imagine white being able to do anything here concrete, in particular because the rook is also hanging. So white moved the rook away to a5. And now I went king e5, seizing my new home in the middle of the board now that the d-pawn was gone. And now I actually have pretty good control. And the thing is, this e3 pawn is just as weak as my d5 pawn. And my bishop does a really good job of eyeing the queening square that the g-pawn might want to usher itself to. So I felt pretty good here. White played rook a6, eyeing my bishop. And then I went rook b2 check, just putting the pressure to that king. Bishop e2 was played. And then I went rook b8. And the idea was now I'm going to try and round up that pawn with rook g8 and rook g5. And here you really don't have a great way to respond because if you go king g3 trying to protect the pawn like that, I can go rook b3. And this is in fact what happened is I attack the e3 pawn and you have to decide, do I ignore this and push or do I give up the pawn? And the issue is if you ignore it, I take with check and then just come back and I come back for the g-pawn with rook b8 next, and the pawn isn't going anywhere. So because of that, white actually went back with king f2, and then I went rook b8, king g3, rook b3, king f2, rook b8, and we actually agreed to a draw here because, we're just repeating, and that was threefold. I was very happy with my defense in this game. I must say, I thought I did a really, really nice defensive job. I really got into a bad position from the jump with the minority attack. My autopilot strategy of just playing g6, knight g7, and trading the light squared bishops left me with a really, really chronic weakness on c6, and I just had to gut it out. And I was really proud of the way I was able to do that because I thought my position was so awful. I looked afterward with the computer, and it turned out I wasn't actually losing at any moment, but it's the type of position that humans really, really struggle defending, where it's 0.6 or 0.7 for white, close to a pawn up for white pretty much, and just hard to defend all your weaknesses. So I think if you were to, just think about a takeaway from this game, it's just about when you're worse, trying to keep everything protected, not creating any additional weaknesses, and then seizing on some opportunities for counterplay when they arise. I was able to do that by trading some pieces at opportune moments and kind of just toughening it out when it seemed like I was going to be tortured. So Those are things to do when you're in a worse position. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks.